So just while we're about to kick off, we've got a great diverse registration list of participants. A lot of you are from brokers, forwarders, the supply chain sector, so service provider sector. And I'm grateful that you've all taken the interest and time to join us on the webinar, because it does directly impact your customers, your client base as importers and exporters. So what I will do, I'll start to kick off the presentation. Now I believe we've got a strong list of attendees already participating. So today's event is modern slavery reporting for importers and exporters. And it is very much an overview event. There is a lot of information, a lot of data we'd love to share with you. And we hope to share with all of you in coming weeks and months in more detailed, more sector-based events that we can drill a bit deeper into some of these really important factors. But for the benefit of, for those of you who may not be clear about what modern slavery is, there are a number of categories. And what we're focusing on today is more around the labour, forced labour, around supply chain. So the focus of today's discussion is really around the working conditions. And I'll read out the modern slavery definition. So modern slavery refers to situations where one person has taken away another person's freedom. Their freedom to control their body, their freedom to choose to refuse certain work or stop working so that they can be exploited. So freedom is taken away by threats, violence, coercion, abuse of power and deception. The net result is that a person cannot refuse or leave that situation. So it is a very important and real and increasingly exposed problem that all of us face, and it is a global problem. In Australia, we're not immune from that, and because of the United Nations rollout of the Global Compact, it's increasingly being adopted as legislation as Australia has taken up as well. So we'll get into more detail. What I'm going to do now is the purpose of that event is to give you that background. As I mentioned earlier, it is a very high level overview, and then we'll break down into more detail in the coming weeks and months. But without further ado, I'd like to introduce you. I'll ask actually them to introduce themselves, your fantastic panelists for today's event. And I'll kick off with Michael Milnes from Supplied Legal. So Michael, I'll hand over to you to introduce yourself.
Thanks, Lawrence. My name is Michael Milnes. I'm a solicitor. I specialise in commercial law and particularly in supply chain. So I work with clients in the supply chain, e-commerce, consumer goods sectors, and I help them build fast, reliable, ethical supply chains, and focusing on commercial law issues.
Thanks, Michael. Next, we've got coming up on the panel will be David Brightling from the Australian Border Force and Home Affairs.
Hi, Lawrence, and hi, everybody. Thanks for having me on this webinar today. So my name is David Brightling. I'm the Assistant Secretary of the Modern Slavery Human Trafficking Branch in Australian Border Force. One of my roles is to oversee the Modern Slavery Act Business Engagement Unit, which is a unit in my team, which I'll talk a little bit about in further detail during my presentation, but essentially is acts to assist reporting entities, including businesses, to understand their obligations under the Modern Slavery Act and to help provide guidance as they're navigating their way through the process of developing a modern slavery statement.
Thanks, David. And David, in real terms, is probably the keynote speaker for today's topic around the reporting requirements. So thanks, David, for joining us. Next, we'll have Serena Grant from Minderoo Walk Free Initiative.
Thanks, Lawrence, and good morning, everyone. I'm at Walk Free, which is part of Minderoo Foundation here in Perth. We are a global human rights organisation, and we work towards ending modern slavery in all its forms. So my role at Walk Free is to lead our business engagement activities, which includes focusing on combating forced labour in supply chains. Thanks.
Thanks, Serena. And last but not least, we'll have Mikaylie Page presenting at the end from ASAP.
Hi, I'm Mikaylie from the ASEAN-Australian Strategic Youth Partnership. We're a group of around 50 volunteers from across the Southeast Asian Australia region, advocating for youth voices in tackling important policy issues. My role there, I am the digital events manager and also the project manager for an exciting program that we have coming up called the Australia-Indonesia Modern Slavery Youth Project.
Thanks, Mikaylie. So now you've all been introduced to the panelists and presenters, and I'd like to kick off with Michael Milnes to talk about the history of modern slavery legislation and how it's evolved. So over to you, Michael. I'll go on mute and look forward to handing over to our next speaker in about 10 minutes.
All right, just bear with me whilst I share my screen. And all right, hopefully you've all got the presentation there. All right, so yep, so as Lauren says, I'm just going to give a little bit of history, a little bit of context to what we're talking about when we're talking about the Modern Slavery Act and when we're thinking about modern slavery in the supply chain. So we'll jump into it. I've just put this slide up for some context in terms of the numbers around the world and what is this problem that we're grappling with. So best estimates, more than 40 million people around the world in modern slavery. With COVID-19, we're expecting, of course, that numbers to potentially rise because of kind of global recession and poverty and situations that people are going to be finding themselves in. So it's a huge international problem, and more than half of that problem is located on our doorstep here in the Asia-Pacific region. So more than half of that 40 million number is literally on Australia's doorstep. And you kind of see that instantly the problem that we've got, which is you have Australia there as a wealthy consumer nation on the doorstep of countries that perhaps are, have a poor human rights record or have high degrees of poverty or corruption, producing goods and services. And here in Australia, the clamour for ever cheaper and more goods and services. So as a consumer nation, goods are imported into the country. We've got this real risk of modern slavery literally on our doorstep. So obviously, the Modern Slavery Act is a fairly new requirement here in Australia, but of course it comes out of other initiatives and other obligations and attempts to tackle this problem. So we've got an international framework, and we've got the UN Guiding Principles, we've got the Sustainable Development Goals. So these international frameworks, international obligations on member states and requiring or requesting companies to respect human rights in their businesses and operations. So we have that international framework, and countries give effect to it in different ways. But we have that kind of overarching framework that companies have developed their own responses to modern slavery. And then, of course, sometimes we have these high-profile examples that kind of jump through into the media. So you've put some examples up there, but the Nike, Apple examples, or for example, the disasters or tragedies that have occurred in garment factories in Bangladesh. We know the story about conflict minerals. So these sort of quite high-profile examples that sort of pop through into the consciousness every now and again. And we're hearing more and more of that, and there's more attention being paid to these problems of modern slavery in the goods and services that we consume every day. So Australia is not the first of the Australian, and we're going to hear more from David very soon on the detail of the Australian legislation, modelled quite heavily on the UK legislation. There's other examples around the world as well. So California, supply chain transparency, Netherlands, more particularly focused on child labour in the supply chain. So we've had this evolution of national and state laws coming through. So that's to kind of bear in mind that there are legal obligations in those states, territories, and nations around the world. So if you're doing business there or importing, exporting into countries, you have to kind of know about what the local requirements are, whether you have to comply as an organization or whether your customers have to comply. So because there's a focus on supply chain, if you've got customers that have to comply with particular requirements in particular places, well, then they're going to be asking you questions about your supply chain. So looking up to you and asking what you're doing about it. So this might come from legal obligations. It might also come from sort of more voluntary or best practice obligations. So I've mentioned there the international standards for sustainable procurement. So if companies are signed up or using that particular international standard, then that could drive activity and operations within their business that they're going to be asking you about, and because you're supplying to them or working with them, what you're doing about these issues. Just moving on then, in terms of the history and how this progresses, I've just put this slide up as kind of a background, really, which is that when we're thinking about corporate social responsibility and what companies have to do, so from a compliance point of view, you've got to remember that it's not purely compliance, it goes beyond legal compliance and gets into what the community expects us to do. So I've used that example there of the Banking Royal Commission. So all the stories that we heard here in Australia about what the big banks were doing wrong, you know, those banks have got armies of lawyers, compliance experts. A lot of what they were doing was technically and legally correct, and you know, in some cases it wasn't, and those have been found out. But for the most part, everything they were doing was technically legal. But when we started to hear some of the practices, we thought, well, no, this doesn't really fit with our social expectations, where the community is. You know, we allow these banks to make big profits. Do we think that these are the kind of practices that they should be engaged in? So you get these kind of concepts of community standards, community trust, social license to operate. And then it's not necessarily a clear line where that line is. And it's going to be different in different industries, and different organizations are going to take different approaches to how they approach those issues. It's about thinking about what stakeholder expectations are. So yes, there's the legal compliance piece. But as you go into that and thinking, well, what do we have to do to comply? We also have to think, what do our stakeholders expect? And that's going to depend on the individual organization. And stakeholders, obviously the shareholders and investors, but increasingly employees want to work at organizations that are doing the right thing and are being seen to do the right thing. We said before, if customers have legal obligations or they care about these issues, then we should, if we're supplying to those organizations, then we should care about those. Governments and government procurements, and taking more and more an interest in what companies are doing. The companies, communities in which we do business, so we've got overseas operations and we employ people in other markets, what impact we're having there. And then, you know, the court of public opinion, the media, do things pass the pub test, and you know, if it was brought out into the media, is this seen as something that we want to be associated with as a company? So you've got that sort of shifting, and that's shifted over time, alongside the, you know, the regulations moving on. We've got new regulations coming through all the time. So there's no real sort of fixed point in time where you can say, well, this is what it's going to look like now for the foreseeable future. These things are always evolving. We've had the new regulations around whistleblowing. Foreign bribery regulation is again on the agenda to be tightened up. So Parliament's been looking at that quite recently. Now the modern slavery laws. So you've got this kind of context of regulations moving on, social community expectations moving on. You've got that backdrop to think about as you go into thinking about modern slavery and what are we going to do, what do we have to do, and what should we do? So it's kind of drawing out those two questions. So just then focusing where we're at now, focusing a bit more of the expectation around modern slavery. So we had that before, you know, Australia there, it's, you know, Australia already had pretty robust employment laws. So yes, there is potential and is current modern slavery happening here within Australia, but the bigger impact that we have is as a consumer nation and driving that demand for goods and services across the region. So we've got Modern Slavery Act, really about increasing awareness, getting these things on the boardroom agenda. You know, we all knew this was a problem, but companies would never get to it. It was always too busy doing something else. So this really pushes it onto the agenda. You know, and it's from that perspective, it's already working. Before anybody's had to comply with any legal requirements, we're here on a webinar. We're all talking about it. You know, this is drawing together representatives from government, business, NGOs, working together, putting different perspectives on it. So there's already increased awareness. It's getting out there into the media more often. It's getting onto the boardroom agenda, which is exactly what the intention was. So before anybody's had to kind of sign off on anything or comply with anything, it's already having an effect at driving awareness and getting it onto the corporate agenda. The focus of the law is really on increasing transparency. So a lot of companies are already doing the right thing, and this is an opportunity for them to be seen to be doing the right thing. And then companies that weren't really focusing on it, well, then we're all going to be able to see what they are and aren't doing. So as we go into this, we'll hear very shortly about the legal compliance requirements. We've got to remember, we might not have a particular compliance requirements on our organization, but if our customers do, well, then they might care what we're doing. And also that's against stakeholder community expectations. What do we need to be doing? I've asked the questions there, is legal compliance enough? So yes, you might tick off all the legal requirements, but is that going to be enough in terms of popular opinion and stakeholder expectations and everything else? If it turns out that there was modern slavery in your organization's supply chain, or that you've contributed to it, is the "we didn't know about it" excuse going to be good enough? And increasingly that's not. That used to be the kind of "we didn't know about it and we can't be to blame for it." Well, that's not going to be a good enough excuse in the future. More people do know about this problem. More people are doing things about it. Looking at what we have to do, and then thinking about what we are going to do. No company has unlimited resources and time. We have busy, some companies now, especially the COVID situation, struggling for survival or have operational challenges. They don't have unlimited resources. They've got to decide what is it that they're going to do and how much effort they're going to put into it. But then the really important question is, if whatever we're going to put into it, how do we get the most impact out of that? So how do we make sure that the time and effort that we are able to put into this, that we really have the biggest impact that we can to eradicating modern slavery? All right, that was my brief introduction to set some context. I'm going to hand back to Lawrence. If anybody would like to stay around at the end for Q&A, I'll be around at the end as well. And always happy for people to connect, LinkedIn, phone number, email. Happy to jump on a call afterwards if people have questions. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Michael. It's definitely a great way to set the backdrop and set the scene, and why it is so important, not just for Australian importers, but also for Australian exporters who need to navigate the equivalent or similar legislation when they do enter new markets in other global, in other countries, I should say. So now we're going to hand over to David Brightling from Border Force, and he'll go into more detail around the specific act and the reporting required to themselves. So without further ado, I'll hand over to yourself, David, and I'll catch you again in about 10 minutes or so. Cheers.
Thanks, Lawrence. Bear with me while I share the screen with everybody. Hopefully everyone can see that. Look, Michael's painted a really good picture of the scale of the problem globally that we're dealing with in some of his earlier slides in that presentation. And I guess there's often a misconception that modern slavery doesn't occur in Australia and doesn't exist here. And the statistics show that that's not the case. And last year, the Australian Institute of Criminology, in conjunction with law enforcement agencies and the Minderoo Foundation, did an estimate and estimated that between 2015 and 2017, there were up to 1,900 victims of modern slavery in Australia. The key message is that this is something that does take place in Australia, and often people are quite surprised when they hear that. The Modern Slavery Act is part of a series of policies and legislative frameworks in place that the government has in place to address this crime that is occurring in Australia. So can I just say once again, thank you very much for having me on today's webinar. I'm very pleased to be talking about the Modern Slavery Act. So Australia's Modern Slavery Act aims to reduce modern slavery risks in supply chains of Australian goods and services by increasing supply chain transparency. The Act entered into force on 1 January last year, and applies to roughly 3,000 entities that are in the Australian market that have an annual consolidated revenue of over $100 million. This includes, of course, large import-export companies as well. Entities that are captured by the Modern Slavery Act are required to prepare annual modern slavery statements, and these are statements that explain their actions that they have taken to respond to modern slavery risks in their global operations and supply chains over their reporting year. The statements must respond to 7 criteria, and those 7 criteria are outlined in the Act, and they include describing key areas of modern slavery risks, actions that entity has taken to address those risks, and how the entity is undertaking an assessment of how effective those actions are. As Michael indicated in his presentation, those statements must be approved by the board and signed by a director before they are submitted to the Australian government, and those statements will be published online on a central online register, which we're in the process of building at the moment. The statements must be provided to us 6 months after the end of the entity's reporting period. However, we have just recently announced a 3-month extension for entities who were due to submit their statements this year in 2020. So for most, what I expect at most reporting entities that are on the Australian financial year, they will have 9 months to submit their modern slavery statements, which takes you through till March 2021. As I indicated in my introductory remarks, the government has established a modern slavery business engagement unit, which sits within Border Force. And the role of that unit is to provide support to entities to help entities understand the legal obligations and to understand how to comply with the Act. So how can government support you to comply? There are 3 ways that we're working with entities to support compliance with the Act. The first is by providing guidance material. We've worked with business and civil society to develop a very detailed and comprehensive guidance document, which you can find online. And it takes you through all of the steps that you should follow in preparing your modern slavery statement, in particular with reference to the 7 mandatory criteria, which I spoke about earlier. In addition to that, we've recently put online some additional guidance which relates to the COVID-19 impacts, and that's also a useful document right now for businesses who are responding to disruption in supply chains and other disruptions to their business. The second way that we can support you is through providing direct advice about the Act, and the key way to get in touch with us is through email, through slavery.consultations@abf.gov.au, and someone will get in touch with you to provide advice either through an email or to follow up with a phone call. And finally, we have been delivering a number of workshops in person last year and in the early part of this year, and increasingly, of course, like everybody else, moving into the online environment. So stay tuned for more information on those. We do publicise those on social media and online. And we also have a mailing list which participants in today's webinar are able to contact us and to join that mailing list, so they get advance notice of those presentations. I just wanted to finish by sharing 3 key messages for entities who are preparing their modern slavery statement. The first is to take a targeted risk-based approach to combating modern slavery. And I guess it's important to make the point that the Act does not require you to certify that your supply chains are slavery-free, but instead what we want you to do is to have a look at your supply chains and identify those key risk areas. And many of those key risk areas and risky products that are well known For example, you may be importing a large amount of rubber gloves in the current environment, which we know and are well documented to have a high risk of modern slavery attached to their production. Secondly, we want to see entities to continually develop and refine their responses over time. And this is not a set and forget a compliance piece of legislation. What we are looking for is statements which evolve over time and demonstrate that entities are evolving in how they're reviewing their key risks in their supply chains and how they're responding to those, and activities that they're taking to respond to those are not activities that will be limited to a 12-month reporting window. We would expect that those activities will continue over a number of years. So a continual improvement and a continual development over time. And of course, no one will have the perfect response in year one, and we fully understand that, and that is okay as well. But what we would like to see is an explanation of how your entity is planning to take steps in the future to respond to modern slavery risks in your supply chain. Thirdly, it's important to look for opportunities to work with business partners, with suppliers, and with civil society groups and industry groups to share expertise and experiences, and this is already happening a lot in a number of different sectors, where we're starting to see some really pleasing examples of cross-sectoral collaboration to identify common risk areas in sectors and to talk about common strategies for addressing those risks. So that's they're three key messages for the purposes of today that we thought would be useful to leave you with.
Great.
Thanks, Lawrence. I'll hand back to you.
Thanks, David. It was a great presentation. I am going to leave a lot of the more detailed questions till the end, but there's a really short one which you might be able to address now, David. So we've got a few more minutes on your allocation. So Sonia Duncan has asked, will the government be providing a list of entities captured by the Act so that civil society can hold them to account? Are you aware of a reporting mechanism or list or website?
As far as I'm aware, there isn't a publicly available list of entities. Obviously, the revenue threshold means that list is a dynamic list, and it will change year on year, subject to how companies are faring and where their revenue falls. So it isn't a static list. Obviously, and I think the question goes to this, that there will be a high degree of transparency and interest from civil society. So my expectation would be that that entities that would clearly fall, would be clearly captured by the Act, will be scrutinised for failure to submit a statement and by civil society. You know, transparency and public transparency will drive a lot of this process. But there isn't a static list of entities that I'm aware of that's in the public domain.
Great. Thanks, David. Thanks again for that presentation. I'll encourage all of you to, first and foremost, definitely register your details on the email that David has provided earlier, and we can provide as a follow-up as well, to stay up to date with all the latest feedback and information updates. So now we're going to hand over to Serena Grant. And Serena, I'll ask you to share screens, and I'll let you kick off with that. Thanks, David, and look forward to speaking to Serena.
Thanks, Lawrence, and thanks, David. That was great. As one of the civil society organisations planning to hold businesses to account, you know, that's a really great question, and I can say that in terms of our plans, I think the Australian government has made it much easier for us to do that than they did in the UK, where the requirement in the UK was just to host the modern slavery statement on your website, whereas here I believe the government will actually be providing a site where all of the statements will be in one place, which makes it much easier to both find the statements and compare from a transparency perspective. I'm just going to share my screen now. I'll start here. So we've already heard a little bit about the global statistics in terms of prevalence of modern slavery, so I won't dwell too much on these, but these numbers come from our Global Slavery Index. So we produce the most comprehensive estimates of prevalence of modern slavery on a country by country basis. We also produce that global number, the 40.3 million people around the world, in partnership with the International Labour Organization. So they're fairly well accepted numbers internationally. You can see there that over 70% of victims are female, and within that number, close to 25 million are in forced labour, so really within supply chains. As Michael noted, a big chunk of that number is here in our region in Australia, Asia and the Pacific. So we've got close to 25 million people just in that region, which is over 60% of the global number. And this slide breaks down those numbers a little bit more. So in addition to estimating the prevalence of modern slavery in each country, we also look at the government's response. So do they have strong laws? Do they enforce those laws? Do they have services for victims? Do they have supply chain transparency laws like they do in Australia? And all of those things combined, there's a number of indicators that we look at to see how strong the government's response is. And you can see down the bottom there that the average score for this region is CCC. The vulnerability score that you can see there on the right, it looks at what are the risk factors in that country, what's driving modern slavery. Conflict, poverty, lack of opportunity for decent employment, decent work, are all driving factors of slavery. And again, as Michael suggested, COVID is not going to help any of those vulnerability indicators. This is a list, again, taken from the Global Slavery Index, which sets out a list of products that are at risk of forced labour by source country. So I won't go through any of those. Again, you know, I think a lot of them will be familiar because they have been in the press. There has been big scandals about some of them, but others maybe less so. And I think both Michael and David talked about Australia's importing risk. So we know that globally there's $354 billion worth of goods that are at risk of forced labour that are imported into the G20 countries. So developed economies are importing a lot of goods that are being produced with forced labour. This slide really shows where some of those goods are coming from, which countries, and at the top there you can see that the top 5 products that are imported into Australia that are at risk. And so this might seem a little bit obvious. Why should business act? After just following David's presentation, because we've got legislation here, and Michael's presentation giving us an overview of the global legal framework. One thing I would like to emphasise there is that while Australia is one of the few countries that does have supply chain transparency laws, I think we're seeing a real global trend. So, you know, Michael mentioned we've got these laws in California and the UK and now Australia. France, Netherlands and the EU also have similar human rights due diligence laws. We've seen a number of other countries proposing bills and discussing introducing laws like this. So I think there's a real trend towards this. And again, as Michael mentioned, stakeholder expectations really are changing. Consumer expectations are changing, and so are investors. I think in particular in the last few years, we've seen a lot more activism from investors, whether that's large pension funds or sovereign wealth funds in Norway. There's the very large sovereign wealth fund that divests from companies where they believe that they're not taking the right steps to combat forced labour in supply chains. So I think this is increasingly going to be on the agenda of a lot of big companies. And you know, in addition to that investor-driven action, we're also seeing increased disclosure requirements for companies, whether that's stock exchanges or other financial disclosures. On the sort of reputational side, it's also a really big risk. Every time a scandal comes out in the press, it's costing companies a lot of money. And we've seen a number of cases around the world, some in the US, some in Canada, establishing corporate liability for modern slavery in supply chains. Lastly, I'll just go through the last point here around the sort of business case for doing this. So beyond all these legal obligations and international and human rights obligations, a lot of the companies that we engage with actually tell us that this is important for their business. This actually helps improve productivity and quality control. They've said, you know, where you've got problems with forced labour, you've probably also got a bit of corruption there. You've probably got problems with quality and, you know, retention of staff. So addressing this can also help to address other problems in your supply chain. And then the last thing in terms of the sort of legal framework and emerging laws that hasn't been mentioned yet is the US Tariff Act. So goods can be seized at the border in the US now if there is a concern that they're produced or they're at risk of being produced with modern slavery. And civil society can submit, and others can submit evidence where they believe that there's strong evidence that goods have been produced in that way. And we saw a number of seizures towards the end of last year. I think there were sort of 5 different seizures from 5 different countries and industries. So that again is a real risk if you're either your company or if you're a broker for your customers, having goods seized at the border is really not what you want to happen. So I think doing your due diligence throughout your supply chain is going to become increasingly important to enable those imports and exports to flow. Lastly, we just released a report. We released a report last week about the impacts of COVID-19 on vulnerable workers and the increased risk of exploitation and modern slavery. And it's something we're really concerned about. You know, we're seeing millions of migrant workers around the world losing their jobs and often stranded. So they are stuck in countries, unable to get other jobs because of travel restrictions or lockdowns. And they're generally excluded from government support in those countries. So it's a very precarious situation for them. So we're really urging business and government to collaborate to address some of those risks. And I think, again, as Michael suggested at the start, this is going to really increase the risk of modern slavery. And I think that that's something that all businesses should be aware of. They should be aware of how it's increasing the risk and what they can do to mitigate that risk. So within the report, we've got some brief guidance in terms of what those key risks are to vulnerable workers, but also looking at, you know, we've set out an action plan, what business and government should do, how they can collaborate, and what are the key actions they can take to protect people. I'll finish up there because I'm sure there are a lot of questions, and I know Mikaylie still needs to give her presentation. So thank you, Lawrence.
Great. Thanks, Serena. It's a fantastic report, and I think Charlotte has shared that with all the participants. So have a look out for that. Click on the link and download the report. It's really valuable and important reading. So just before I quickly go into my short 5-minute presentation, just to let you know, thank you for all the questions coming through. what we are doing is we've got an allocated Q&A session just past after mine and Mikaylie's short presentation. So in about 10 minutes, we'll kick off into a Q&A session. I'll open up the full panel and we can discuss some of your questions as a group. So just bear with us, and we'll be back to you very soon. I'm just about to share my screen. Give me one sec. Okay, hopefully everyone can see my screen from here. I'm just going to spend a really quick 5 minutes on supply chain transparency, traceability, and trade modernisation. So for those of you who don't know me from the Ethical Trade Alliance, many of you know me from the Australian Trade and Logistics Corporation, we're about to launch a really powerful initiative called the Ethical Trade Alliance, which is trying to help companies establish trust across their supply chains. And why it's relevant to today's discussion is because companies, even though they're in Australia, it's a 100 mil turnover reporting requirement, many of those companies still rely on smaller importers or distributors to provide them with their product, which they can then sell to the end consumers. So some of those things, the challenges faced are where companies really need to understand how they can engage properly with their suppliers, how they can reach out to them, have a systematic framework which is affordable and within reach, and especially for SMEs who may not have the big resources and departments within their organisation to do a lot of this themselves. So the importance now across global supply chains, again, Australia is that legislation now is becoming enforceable, as we've noticed and as we've seen throughout the presentations. But it's really important now for companies here in Australia, regardless of your turnover, to be honest, to really start engaging with your suppliers, working with them to identify, collaborate and participate so you can help them become better suppliers for you as well. Some of that can be done remotely through digital technology, just like we're doing now on webinars and Zoom. There are a whole range of new initiatives that we will spend another webinar event on, and specific to trade modernisation and audit processes. The other thing is around product provenance and traceability. You know, we have this even right now with PPE within the health crisis around the world, where there's fake and false products. It's been big in pharmaceutical, food products, fashion accessories, a whole range of things. But really importantly as well, people are now looking for full product lifecycle management. They want to be able to tell what's happening with the disposability of the product, equally as important as the manufacturing process. So there is a number of ways that companies around the world are using things like blockchain, things like new digital platforms and traceability systems to help companies track and trace their products and their entire supply chain milestones right through to disposability. Now, that's also important for consumers, which I know has been touched on already with some of the other panelists, and I know Mikaylie will talk about that in the final presentation. But consumers are choosing with their wallet, so to speak. They will support, and the ROI has now been demonstrated quite substantially around the world, that consumers are very rapidly moving towards supporting ethical and sustainable brands. Finally, trade modernisation. We talked about blockchain just now. Again, this is a very quick, short snippet about some things that we'll go into in much more detail in subsequent events. But trade modernisation and free trade agreements, what's occurring now with this Australian legislation, with the Modern Slavery Act, has got direct impacts on current and future trade agreements between Australia and all other countries and other markets as well. So there is a number of ways that product provenance, proof of region, proof of brand, all those type of things are now coming into free trade agreements. Governments around the world are using technology to really try and support and protect their own markets and support their growers of certain things. One of those examples could be champagne from France, and cheeses and things like that, where they can actually protect the brand reputation through digital technology and product traceability, and how that can be leveraged across other country free trade agreements to protect those markets and regions. So that's really it from me. Again, really short and sharp. We will be having some more events on specific trade modernisation, supply chain milestone and digital tracking for products and provenance, but that's not part of today's session, just a quick snippet. So just going back to stopping my share, and now we're going to hand over to Mikaylie Page to do our final presentation on some really important topics, great initiatives, but also to have the feedback and input from the next generation of leaders coming through. So thanks so much, Mikaylie. I'll hand over to yourself.
Thanks, Lawrence. I'll just share my screen. So I wanted to start off just with a little bit of a background about ASIP as an organisation. So ASIP is the ASEAN-Australian Strategic Youth Partnership, and we are made up of a group of over 50 active volunteers from across Australia and Southeast Asia. So we're all dedicated to enhancing people-to-people links and collaboration on important policy issues across the region. And we're working with established organisations and institutions to become the leading organisation for promoting the partnership between ASEAN and Australian youth and raising the profile of regional relations and enhancing peace and prosperity. So last year we had our first regional program, which brought together 40 young leaders from across ASEAN and Australia. We had over 900 applicants, which was pretty amazing. And we focused on pressing regional challenges like the digital economy, disaster resilience, and counter-terrorism initiatives. So in terms, to follow on from Lawrence's presentation, so modern slavery is an issue that is increasingly becoming part of consumer consciousness. Consumers are more aware of the ethical implications of production and are switching their purchasing behaviour accordingly. As Michael and Serena both touched on, businesses are becoming more accountable to social expectations. So in relation to how companies are sourcing their goods and services from within Australia, but also as an importing nation from abroad. So on that note, it's really important to fight modern slavery because of these issues, but also because it's something that young people care about, and it's a problem that hinders human development everywhere across the globe. So young people are increasingly informed about these issues and human rights injustices happening around the world. These are made more transparent with increasing traceability of supply chains, but also so we're surrounded by media and news and videos that are showing us what the reality of this information, of what modern slavery looks like on the ground. And people and consumers are increasingly willing to support companies and products that don't rely on slavery to produce the goods that we use. So there's been a huge rise in popularity in apps such as Good On You and Freedom, which promote transparency and compliance in supply chains. These movements are promoting sustainable change, making people make meaningful consumer choices, and making that information more accessible to everyone. So traceable supply chain movements such as Know the Chain and Oxfam's Naughty and Nice list are causing shifts in consumer behaviour as well, and causing a move from fast industries towards companies with ethical supply chains that are branded as ethical suppliers. So right now, there are currently, as Serena touched on, there are a lot of modern slaves in the Asia Pacific. There's over 25 million in our region, and it's a global human rights issue. So one thing that ASIP is really passionate about, and one would like to kind of point out, is that it is possible for us to eradicate modern slavery in this lifetime. We've definitely seen a huge increase and movement from young people that we're engaging with across the region who are willing to stand up for this belief. And we think that right now is a really opportune time to engage on these issues, because in passing the Modern Slavery Act, Australia has not only renewed its commitment to being a leader in tackling this issue, but also has shone a light on Australian businesses and their responses to meeting these obligations. So it's an exciting opportunity to use this attention on Australia and our regional partners to highlight innovative solutions. ASIP as an organisation, we are really committed to featuring young voices in that conversation, because this is an issue that disproportionately affects young people. So I'll just swap over to our website. So the Australia-Indonesia Modern Slavery Youth Project is a project that is being run by ASIP in partnership with the Ethical Trade Alliance, to bring together young professionals, business people, faith leaders, social change makers to understand modern slavery in the region and to find innovative ways for businesses and governments to cooperate to address these challenges. So we really want to engage young people who are already working in this space, already have a lot of knowledge in this space, so that we can come up with some thought leadership to kind of lead the way in how we as a country and businesses in Australia can kind of get behind this. So the program will strengthen regional ties between engaged young people passionate about making a difference. So it will highlight the role of emerging voices, generate thought leadership, and develop policy inputs and business solutions with a focus on leveraging unique experiences of young leaders. So the program will be made up of an online program that will run for about 6 months, where young people will be engaged in workshops, collaboration, opportunities and capability training, and will culminate in an in-person forum to be held next year to solidify those international relationships and create long-lasting networks of young people energized to take on modern slavery in all its forms. So modern slavery is emerging as a pivotal issue for businesses and governments. This project is a window for Australian businesses to look into ASEAN and Australian markets to find ways that we can collaborate to find business solutions. So here you can find information about the project, our partners, and some resources, including Walk Free's Global Slavery Index. And you can, if you'd like to help support this project, you can get in contact with us by filling out this form at the bottom of the page. It's the best way to get in contact with us if you're interested in hearing more about the project or if you'd like some more information. So I'll pass back to you, Lawrence.
Great, thanks so much, Mikaylie. As you've all seen, it's a fantastic initiative for a whole range of reasons, but if you really simple it down or dumb it down, you know, ASAP, they represent not only the future leaders of tomorrow, but they're the current consumers as well. So you know, you really want to get involved with them, support them as much as possible, because it benefits all of your businesses, all of your suppliers, stakeholders, but the environment, the planet, and obviously people's lives as a whole. So definitely reach out to Mikaylie, Haley and the team, and get in touch with them and do your best to support them wherever possible. So now what I'm going to do is open up to Q&A, and I'll ask all the panelists to reactivate your microphones and video if you like. So it'd be great now we've got a few questions that came through, and I'm going to start just in chronological order. So Rob Jackson from Rigby Cook, thanks Rob for sending through an email. So Rob, I'll just read out the questions, and I'll pass a few I'll open up to the panel to discuss. So Rob's first question was, some companies say HR should be in charge, whereas HR says corporate responsibility should sit with procurement. Any views on how to effectively ensure a company has an effective internal mechanism to monitor compliance? So I know, Michael, you've had some experience with that direct firsthand. Do you want to take a stab at that one?
Yes, can do, Lawrence. So yeah, so it is a common one. It is an HR issue, and then before people really start to understand the problem, then they start to realize, supply chain, and then beyond supply chain, it's not just supply chain, but operations as well. So, it's not purely a procurement thing. Where I've seen it work best is where we've brought everybody into the room and formed a team around it, so that different parts of the organization are represented in the effort. So there's not purely an HR. HR might need to be involved because there could be a training element to it. There could be policies and processes implemented and that kind of thing, but it's not purely an HR thing. It's not purely a procurement thing. It can bring in people who work on risk as well, the legal team. So, the best way that I've seen it managed is where it brings in all the stakeholders together, perhaps with one person kind of running it or chairing it, so they're a champion for it. But it really works better when there's a coordinated response across the organization.
Great. And Serena, can I ask you as well for your input on this? And what I've noticed to the panel as well, that there's emerging, especially with bigger organizations, but even now with new startups, they've got chief trust officers or ethics officers. So is that something that you see, Serena, sort of emerging, and maybe your take on as well, what companies should be doing or how best to manage this type of task?
Yeah, I'd probably echo what Michael was saying. I think you need a sort of cross cross-functional team to really handle it properly, because there are issues there that are going to be legal and compliance. There are others that are corporate social responsibility. I know a lot of our engagement is often with CSR people, but they then have oversight of the issue and work very, very closely with the procurement teams to make sure that those principles are embedded in the company's procurement processes. And I think what we've seen here in Australia, I mean, this is really the first time a lot of Australian companies have done any kind of human rights due diligence. So it's a first for them to start to think about this, and there's a real shift in thinking. I think, you know, I used to be a corporate lawyer. I used to think this way as well, but when you think about risk, you think about risk to the business. Everybody thinks that way. But actually here, what we're talking about is risk to people. And that's very, very clear in the legislation, in the guidance, that that's what we're talking about. And the teams that are involved in this, whether it's HR or legal or compliance or procurement, need to realise that every step that they're taking to mitigate that risk is mitigating the risk to the people and not the risk, just the risk to the business, because that can have adverse impacts for the people, which is sort of not the outcome that we're looking for here.
Yeah.
I'd add to that in terms of the best way to handle it within your organisation. So one, the cross-functional team is probably the major point, but getting buy-in from the top is crucial. And I think the Australian legislation has been very powerful in that it does require board or director sign-off. And so that means that this conversation needs to be happening in the boardroom of your company. And that's, I think that leadership from the top really impacts the way people in procurement or legal or other teams approach it.
Great, thanks, Serena. David, can I address the next question to yourself? So this is same again from Rob. Emerging practices to monitor compliance. Example: do you develop your own questionnaires for suppliers and send them out, or do you insist on sign up to a third-party agency verifying compliance, or combination? Is there a better weighted observation by Border Force, or is it better doing internal self-audits or supply audits, or is there anything that David, I'll ask you to lead that answer, and then maybe Michael and Serena just to add your comments as well.
Thanks, Lawrence. And maybe just very quickly on that previous question, I would agree with the comments and observations from Michael and Serena about having cross-sectoral working groups and having internal champions and buy-in from the top. And one thing I would just add to that is that the very fact that you have established a cross-sectoral working group that has HR representatives and legal and people from procurement that really understand your business's supply chains is actually something that you can include in your modern slavery statement as an activity that you've undertaken during the reporting year as well. So those internal processes are something that companies are thinking about putting in their modern slavery statement. So I just wanted to add that onto that last question. In relation to the supplier compliance question, there isn't a blanket approach to this, and as we have underscored with the approach to the Modern Slavery Act, it really is a risk-based approach. In some cases, a supplier questionnaire might be the appropriate approach, depending on the nature of your supply chains and the number of suppliers that you have. But of course, some suppliers will be higher risk than others, and for those high risk suppliers, a pro forma questionnaire may not be sufficient. You may need to really have some more in-depth, tailored engagement with those suppliers, and it may not be many. It may be one or two or a handful. But really having a tailored engagement with them that's ongoing throughout the process is probably going to be the more appropriate way to really understand those risks and to really get a sense of how those suppliers are thinking about those risks and engaging with it. So there's really no right or wrong answer here, but I think it's really a question of looking at your supply chains and making that assessment of risk. Lower risk suppliers, a questionnaire might be the right approach to take, and there's certainly no shortage of examples out there of the sorts of supplier questionnaires that that you can look at to get a sense of how to approach that.
Great. Thanks, David. A couple of other questions coming through. Just quickly, the last one is modern slavery encourages dialogue when there are concerns rather than termination of contract. I know that there's at least 2 lawyers with Michael and Serena there. Do you see these creeping into supplier contracts or service level agreements or procurement agreements where that there will be a modern slavery termination clause potentially coming through from a procurement part of the business?
Yeah, shall I go first? You've got 2 lawyers, so you might get 3 opinions. So
I think David might be a lawyer as well.
Okay, there you go. 4.
That's why I said minimum.
And just on the termination point, I mean, I would go back to what David said, which is that this isn't an obligation to ensure that your supply chain is free from modern slavery. So I know some people jump straight to this. If there's a hint or a rumor of modern slavery, well, we've got to terminate that contract. We can't be associated with it. I would flip it around a little bit and say, well, if you're an organization at the bottom of a supply chain and the problem has been discovered, well, then great, and you're probably in a very good place to be able to do something about it. So that going straight to termination might not be the right way to go. That could actually push this supplier further underground, make the problem worse on the ground in the community where this business is operating. So thinking straight to termination, I think that's the kind of the lawyer contract. What does it say? Can we terminate? And if you're going down the termination path, yes, you do need to make sure that you've got the right to be able to do that, and that the facts stack up that you can do that. But really just questioning, that's not what this act is about. And thinking about all those goals are, and thinking, well, actually, this is an opportunity for us to do something here.
Right. Would anyone like to add to Michael's points there, David or Serena, or Mikaylie? Feel free as well.
Yeah, I'm happy to add something to that. I think that was well put, and again, I think it goes to that point about risk to the business versus risk to people. I think the instinct is there's a risk here, it's a PR disaster, terminate the contract, we don't want anything to do with them. And that can actually have really adverse impacts on the workers who are in that situation of vulnerability at that point in time. So your priority should be, how do we first protect the workers before you take any kind of action in that way? I think part of that question that I saw come through was, do you need to have a clause in your contract that says we have the right to terminate if we discover you've got modern slavery? I think I'd encourage it. I think that puts people on notice that you care about this. It's a standard that you expect of your suppliers. As to how you use it, then I think that goes back to Michael's comments around, thinking about it responsibly and how it impacts the workers. Part of the question was also, could you just terminate if you don't have that clause? And I think in most countries, different forms of modern slavery are illegal, and just about every contract I've ever seen says you've got to comply with the laws of your country. So arguably, that supplier's in the wrong and you would have the right to terminate anyway, but I think it's better to include it in there because it does say something about you as an organisation and what you care about and the standard that you expect of your suppliers.
Yeah, great contribution there, Serena, great points. And I think from my own perspective, I think it really goes back to some of Michael's earliest points at the start of the presentation. It's an opportunity to collaborate, as you both mentioned. You can really engage with the supplier, find out where they're failing, and maybe help them by even agreeing to pay some higher prices if need be to improve the workers' conditions with those suppliers. So you're actually hand-holding them to become a better supplier in the long run. So we've got some other questions that came through on Q&A. And I know, David, you had a question from Jeff, and I think you've responded to Jeff, but I'm not sure if you've seen it because it might have come through to all panelists. But I'll just read that out. So Jeff Wilcox, we are a small business, 4 people, supplying promotional merchandise. We buy products from either Australian importers and also direct from suppliers based in China. Several of our clients are large building and property investment companies, and they collaborate on this issue and ask us to fill out very detailed questionnaires, and several of the questions answer with not yet, but we will. So we answer with not yet, but we will. As we are a small company, time is of the essence, so I'm taking the opportunity while working from home to try and answer those responses, but I've so far had difficulty finding simple resources that don't require massive time and cost impact. So I'll skip to the bottom of that. David, I know you responded to that in writing, but I think it's said to all panelists. So I'm just wondering if you could just verbalise that for the benefit of all the audience.
Apologies, I thought that went to everyone. So my response to Jeff was a couple of points. Firstly, if you haven't done so, have a look at the guidance that's online as a starting point, and there are some very simple, practical examples of things that you can do. But particularly for smaller companies, and I guess it goes back to the point I was making earlier about taking a targeted risk-based approach. And you have the benefit of a small number of employees, so you know your supply chains quite well. Have a look at where you think those high risk areas might be. And as I said, it may be a small number of suppliers that you could engage with. And it may be as simple as having that initial conversation about modern slavery risks, which you may not have done before, and to start that conversation and to have that continual engagement. It doesn't necessarily need to be, as the first step, a very lengthy questionnaire, but opening up that dialogue with suppliers can be a first and useful step. This is new legislation. This is new for everybody. So, as I said earlier, we're not looking for an outcome whereby entities make a certification that their supply chains are slavery free. But what we are looking for is those actions that businesses are taking, which is commensurate with the risk profile in their supply chains. And of course, finally, the ABS Modern Slavery Business Engagement Unit is always very happy to have further conversations on specific issues. So please feel free to contact us.
Thanks, David. Just moving, we've got a few other quick questions. I'm mindful of everyone's time. For those of you who do have to drop off, we will make this webinar available on the YouTube channel, so you can refer back to it later. But we've got two other quick questions. So one from Darren Whitaker. He's asked, the first speaker mentioned ISO 2400. Why are reporting companies gravitating towards ISO 20400 when there is a very little coalface investigation into the supply chain and is highly weighted towards environmental as opposed to modern slavery? Why is there not a greater push for social audits such as SA 8000? Is anyone in a position to answer that question amongst the panel?
It was on my slide at the beginning, so I can say something about it. But I put that up there at the beginning as an example of these, I guess, looking at our legal obligations. So in the jurisdictions that you're operating in, so multinational businesses, if they're importing, exporting in and out of different jurisdictions, but then also that there's sort of quasi-legal and voluntary type initiatives and international standards. And in terms of company social obligations, they are informed by things like international standards. That's one of them, and other international frameworks and agreements as well. So it's really looking at what all those different sources of information are, and how that informs what the wider stakeholder expectations are, and then therefore what the company is going to do about it.
Great. Thanks, Michael. Another question from Martrade, I believe that'll be Julius in Melbourne Martrade. Where can I find information about the criteria being applied to identify modern slavery risk in the countries being named on the slide? I'm assuming that's a slide that you had up, Serena, with some of the named countries and some of the risk in each of those areas.
Yes, so probably a good place to start is our Global Slavery Index, which is globalslaveryindex.org. I know that a lot of that information, some of it comes from US Department of Labor lists, which publish a list each year of goods at risk of forced labour, and then there's a number of other sources that they name in there if you're wanting to see why those products have been selected and where the information has come from. In terms of other tools, we, Walk Free, we're actually about to publish a business toolkit where we're going to sort of put the tools that we've produced up there, but also a lot of our partners. So around the world, we work with lots of organisations that focus on modern slavery or business and human rights and have really excellent tools. Some of them come from companies. They've got open source documents. So we're hoping to launch that website in the next month. So we can let everyone know once we've done that as well, because it might be helpful.
Fantastic. Thanks, Serena. I believe that's the last of our Q&A.
Right, so I could just jump in just to add to that. In the guidance that ABF has put out, towards the back there is a table which lists a number of modern slavery risk indicators as well. So for participants who are looking at that document, that there's some useful resources there in addition to the US Department of Labor and the other resources that Serena mentioned.
Great, thanks, David. I'm going to ask Mikaylie, for yourself, what's your awareness amongst the younger generation around, you know, the supply chain impacts of modern slavery? Is that something that going through your tertiary studies and so forth, or even with ASAP before this new initiative with Indonesia, is it something that most people are aware of, or is it sort of coming to the front?
Yeah, I think it's something that's definitely coming to the front. I know the popularity amongst young people that we've been talking to of of things like those apps that I mentioned earlier. There's Freedom, there's also the Baptist Care. They have the Ethical Fashion Guide, the Naughty and Nice list. All of those, Oxfam's Naughty and Nice list, Know the Chain, they're all kind of increasing in awareness, and people are increasingly using them. And I think in light of this new legislation, Australia-wide, but then also New South Wales passed legislation in 2018 regarding modern slavery. I think the awareness of this issue and of supply chains and the importance of being able to track supply chains is something that people are more and more passionate about. And I think that's being reflected in young people's consumer choices.
Yeah, great. All right, well, I believe we've addressed all the questions so far. We've had a great turnout, and thanks to all the panelists for joining us. As I mentioned during the outset, we are hoping to delve a bit deeper into a lot of these topics such as supply audits, traceability. From our perspective with ethical trade, we want to do some things on trade modernisation and blockchain. And we're looking forward to rolling out a lot more detailed information on some of these important factors. And congratulations to Mikaylie on the initiative and ASAP. Serena, great work with that report that launched, and encourage everyone to reach out to yourself and Charlotte to get a copy of that. Michael, thank you for being a great resource in the global aspect of modern slavery and how it's evolved and continuing to evolve. And last but definitely not least, David, thank you, mate, from Border Force, and really encourage everyone to register, obviously as part of the subscription and the update list, but also to reach out to you and the team with Alex over there to really ask their own specific questions around their business, because you've got a wealth of knowledge and resource, and looking forward to collaborating with you all again in the future. So thank you all to panelists, thank you all for participants. We'll make this available on our YouTube channel very soon, within the next 24 hours, and we'll send out a link to the participants so you can use it back as a resource and refer back to that. So thanks very much again, and look forward to seeing you all at one of our upcoming events again in the future.
Thank you, Lawrence. Thanks
Thanks,
everyone.
Lawrence. Thanks for having us.
Great.
Bye.
So take care. Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.